with shortfalls in fuel and electricity becoming more and more common as demand outweighs supply. Today's gospel presents us with a similar conundrum. We encounter another energy crisis. A large crowd of some 5,000 men who had followed the Lord and are now hungry for nourishment. The demand is enormous. The resources are minimal. 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what is that between so many? Indeed, the maths, the logic here, seems irrefutable. The obstacles appear unsurmountable. And how often, especially when it comes to our spiritual lives, do we find ourselves experiencing a similar dilemma? Take the first words of the second reading from St. Paul. St. Paul says, I implore you, lead a life that is worthy of your vocation. Lead a life that is worthy of your vocation. Now, at the theoretical level, we might think to ourselves, they're nice words. It's a noble aspiration. I would love to be faithful to God like that. But it's just not practical. I just don't have the energy to be charitable, gentle, and always patient. I just don't have the energy to really grow in spiritual maturity by actually contemplating God and actually studying my faith with the rigor that it deserves. I just don't have the energy to really work at my marriage, my priesthood, my fractured relationships. I just don't have the energy to pray and fast for that friend that has lapsed in coming to Mass. And so the idea of living a life that is worthy of our vocation, that is to say, to live the life that God has called us to live to get to heaven, to become a saint, remains just a nice theory, but not something we believe we actually have the energy to pursue. For the obstacles just all seem too great, and our resources are too slim. So what do we do instead? Well, we often just start to waste what little energy we might have to complain about the apparent obstacles. Just consider for a moment, myself included, how much time, how much energy do we waste complaining to ourselves and to others? And when we're complaining, it's basically a sign we've resigned ourselves to do nothing about it. Rather than direct what little energy, what little resources we might have towards finding that solution, we squander it, we waste it, and what's going to actually leave us even more miserable. There's a monk, St. Macarius, he said, watch out for complaining and faint-heartedness. It only makes situations much worse, and it only increases our sorrows. Now, the reason why complaining for complaining's sake makes our situation worse and why it increases our sorrows is because ultimately it's an attack on God's providence. We might think I'm complaining about this particular obstacle, or I'm complaining about this particular person, or complaining about this particular circumstance. But at the deepest level, we're really just complaining about God. Why, Lord, didn't you organize things better to make my life easy? Why have you put me in this impossible situation? But this brings us back to the point of the gospel. Is it possible to feed 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fish? Is it possible to lead a life that's worthy of your vocation with human energy alone? The answer is a categorical no. They are both absolutely, fundamentally, insuperably impossible for us. And yet, if we turn away from the temptation just to complain, and instead turn to Christ and offer what little we have, then he will quite literally knock down every obstacle in our path. In the same way Christ knocked down every obstacle to give energy to those 5,000 men, so he prefigured his desire to knock down every single obstacle to give us the energy we need to be saints. Let us think this through for a moment. God becomes one of us. God dies on the cross for us. And now God quite literally becomes our food and our drink in the Eucharist. He has quite literally conquered death to give us the Mass. He has quite literally conquered sin so that we can receive him. He can give himself to us quite literally as our food and our drink in Holy Communion. Honestly, when we begin to think about it spiritually, what more could we ask of God than the Eucharist, the gift of God himself? Truly, how can we Catholics complain if we are people of Holy Communion? Because the miracle of the 5,000 absolutely pales in comparison to the miracle of the transubstantiation that happens at every Mass. Yes, like in the Gospel we take bread. Yes, like in the Gospel we offer it. Yet now, Christ himself is the very substance that we consume, hidden under the appearance of bread and wine. Christ himself quite literally becomes our energy. Now sure, practicing the Catholic faith with the integrity that it deserves is hard. It's very easy to treat the faith as a bit of nice theory, a few interesting, perhaps even compelling ideas, and it's easy enough to tick a few spiritual boxes. I get to Mass, I get to confession every now and then, I even put some money on the plate. But when we actually consider the magnitude of what God is actually asking us to be, to become a saint, when we begin to reflect on what it actually means to live a life that is worthy of our vocation, we can quite easily feel overwhelmed and start to complain and say, it's too hard, I've got too much to do, it's too inconvenient, the church is too out of date, I have too little time, there are just too many obstacles. When in truth, there is really only one obstacle, and that is ourselves. We are the only ones who can get in the way of Christ nourishing and energizing our souls, and we're the only ones that are responsible for leaving ourselves spiritually hungry. God is literally doing everything possible to give himself to us, and yet we are the ones who can refuse it. So next time we're tempted to complain, the next time we're tempted to give up on our vocation to holiness, all we need to do is sit down at this heel of the altar and be nourished by the abundance of God himself. In short, if you fall more and more in love with the Mass, you will persevere. Because if you revere the one who dwells in the host, if you revere the one who thus dwells within you, you will overcome the impossible.